Hello there, Drew Hanish of Whiskey Lore. Time for another whiskey tasting. Today headed to Kentucky and doing a bourbon tasting. And over the last few months I have been going through my cabinet and pulling out some whiskeys and doing tasting videos on everything in my collection. And so there's a lot of whiskeys that I've been ignoring during this time period that I was a more frequent visitor to in the past. But now, I'm drinking a whiskey a day, so it's like, okay, I'm not drinking a lot of my other stock and just really kind of focusing in on what I'm doing my regular tastings on. And so this is a whiskey that the first time I bought it, I had bought it just after doing the tour at the Kentucky Artisan near Louisville, Kentucky, and said, I love the branding. It is Jefferson's very small batch, a blend of straight bourbon whiskeys. And me being the lover of history, I find it ironic actually that they put Jefferson on a whiskey, because Jefferson was not a whiskey fan. He was the one forefather who was a wine drinker and had absolutely no interest in whiskey whatsoever. In fact, his only connection to whiskey is that when he became president, he was probably more wanting to diss Alexander Hamilton, who was his great rival, by throwing out his whiskey tax along with a bunch of other taxes that Hamilton had come up with. And so I think that was just it wasn't really anything about him loving whiskey. He was a small government guy, and so anything he could do to help the little guy out, and the farmers were having a hard time with that tax. So I haven't really tasted this since. Probably, it's been more than 6 months since I've tasted this. I bought a bottle, drank through the bottle, got a second bottle, and this is where the second bottle is right now. This is 41.15% alcohol by volume, which is a very strange kind of number. It was bottled for McLean and Kine, Louisville, Kentucky. So I'm not sure, but it sounds like this was a special bottling that ended up at my local store. Not an expensive whiskey. I think I paid maybe $32 for this when I bought it. And of course, Jefferson's makes the Oceans at Sea, which is the whiskey that goes across the equator a couple times, rocks in the boat, and comes back, and is actually a really interesting whiskey. It's a little pricey to me for what it is, but it is actually a pretty nice bourbon, and interesting to taste something that has aged at sea like that. By the way, if you want to hear a story about aging a whiskey at sea, go to season 5, episode number 1 of the Whiskey Lore Stories podcast, because I talk all about aging whiskeys at sea and where the idea likely came from. So this is an interesting whiskey in that I did a video the other day, and it was about which is better, bourbon or scotch. And of course it was a trick question in a way, because it's up to your palate was pretty much the answer to the question. But I described bourbon as being a brown sugar, vanilla, caramel, oak, those kinds of sweet flavors and different types of flavors that you might get out of a bourbon. Now, that's not to say those are all the flavors, but those are somewhat of the predominant ones that you will find. And scotch, you get more of your orchard fruits, pear, apple, that kind of stuff going on in there, but you can also have smoky and so on and so forth. So I wasn't trying to make it one-dimensional, and it's part of the reason why YouTube Shorts for me was kind of something I avoided doing for a while, only because I didn't want to shorthand the answers. But I want them to be thought-provoking, so I will be doing more of those little shorthand videos to kind of spur thoughts and maybe lead to longer episodes, or maybe it'll be things that I've already talked about. But what I wanted to kind of get across too is that all whiskey kind of changes. It doesn't all have to fit that pat answer, and that bourbon isn't just sweet. And in fact, I got this message from Milan, one of our followers. Thank you, Milan, for your message. By the way, I appreciate all the good feedback. Asking about whether bourbon would be a nice, sweet, and easy drinking whiskey, and yeah, like I say, bourbon will go anywhere from being a very easy drinking to being something you could, tear paint off the walls with if you had to. So there's a variety in both bourbon and scotch. There is a variety. And so, but I was trying to come up with an example of a bourbon that wasn't sweet, and I couldn't think of one. But if I was going to mention one that isn't sweet, isn't it so funny that I did a tasting of this today? Because on the nose, sweet is not the first thing you get. You get a hint of caramel in the background, but it has a very herbally nose to it that I think is coming from the rye, and then a little bit of char and some oak. So this is a very dry bourbon. It does not have tons of sweetness to it. That oak is very dominant, and like I say, very herbally kind of a note on top of that. Cheers. Very pleasant on the palate. Maybe a little honey, a little graham cracker coming in. Really interesting. But it's not sweet. I say honey. There is that honey flavor that's kind of surrounding it a bit. Now the caramel comes in a little bit. Slight bit of pepper, but not much. I mean, very little. That graham cracker stays on the palate as it kind of fades away. Little char note. It is not sweet. This is not a sweet whiskey. This is a very neutral, grainy kind of a whiskey, actually, in terms of its flavor. And it surprises me because when I look at this bottle on my shelf, I have said this, actually, that this is a whiskey I always want to own because it just has a really nice flavor to it. Today, I'm going, yes, I am capturing some things in it that I enjoy, but I don't know that I'm overly in love with it anymore, which, in this modern world where we, fall in love and then suddenly are completely disinterested, maybe that's where I'm at with this, is that this was, at one time, a whiskey that satisfied whatever taste I was trying to go after back then, but now it's not a very complex whiskey. It's just a easy drinking, not overly sweet bourbon whiskey that maybe suits a purpose, but at this point, I don't know that I'm as excited about it as I used to be. So, wow. I mean, one that I think I used to would have put in the very good category. I'm kind of like, yeah, it's okay. It's okay. I mean, it's a good one to have in the cabinet, but I'm not in love with it anymore. It's just kind of a general kind of a flavor that doesn't overly excite me anymore. I guess it happens. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you want to see more of these videos, then give me a like here, and I will continue making these videos along the way. And leave your comments below. Have you nosed and tasted this particular whiskey? Have you tried the Oceans at Sea? Do you think that's worth the money? And other things like that. Or just general discussion is fine as well. And until next time, cheers and Slanjava. A bourbon with a little baby pot still, Irish pot still glimmer in it. Interesting.